we wait for others to join in. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. And we'd be happy to address all questions and comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our Facebook page to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Docent Halmerson, who will be presenting early Flemish art in the 15th and 16th centuries. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll turn things over to you, Docent Halmerson.
Thank you so much, Renata. Without Renata, these lectures would not be possible. And a shout out to Scott Herring, who works for the Timken in our scheduling and education department. And he's also wonderful to handle our Facebook viewers. Before I begin this incredible presentation, not so much because I'm doing it, it's just because I just love this period of art. Somebody asked a really good question on the still life presentation I did last month. And they asked why artists use copper. And I wasn't quite sure, and I don't think it's right to just give some kind of half-baked response. And so I did some research, and it was a great question. And the response is that artists use copper because it had a smoother surface, and it was easier to apply paint. So that's why copper became popular, not hugely popular, but was used primarily for still life because of that, as I said, that smooth surface. And that is also a segue to say that please feel free to ask questions. I love the dialogue. I see some of the viewers are either docents or art historians, and I'm sure you have some great things to contribute, so please feel free. What we're going to be talking about is primarily the 15th century. And it's not that we will ignore the 16th century because it is part of the Flemish Renaissance, but so much of what I'm going to show you comes from under the auspices of the Valois or the Burgundian dukes. And so in this area, which is today Belgium and parts of the Netherlands and Luxembourg, we're concentrating on what would be today Belgium. And in the cities of Brussels and Tournai and Ghent and Bruges, there was an amazing amount of creativity that was occurring. Why is that? Well, the Burgundian dukes were a wealthy French aristocratic group, and there was a lot of trade going on in this region. You know, Bruges, Antwerp, they border the North Sea, so there was a lot of trade. There was the cloth trade was very important in this region. So trade in general, the cloth trade, the development of art and culture. And when there's a lot of art and culture, you have artists being commissioned to do wonderful private paintings for private devotion, but also large triptychs and quadruptychs and polyptychs for churches and private devotion. Another thing that was really happening in this area, Bruges, Ghent, in the 15th century, was the manuscript, the history of manuscript illumination. And there were many artists, Jan van Eyck, for example. We're looking at a masterpiece by Jan van Eyck, who worked in Bruges primarily and Ghent, was that they trained as manuscript illuminators. Why is that important? Well, look at the incredible detail we see even in this marriage portrait of Arnolfini, which we will be talking about specifically in a few minutes, but look at the detail. even the texture of his Arnolfini's hat, it's woven. And if you look closely, you can see just the minute aspects of this painting. A couple of other things I wanted to mention before we move on too is that what do these artists, Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, Dirk Bouts, what do they bring to the art world? Well, Jan van Eyck advances the use of oil painting. He doesn't invent it, but he advances its use and technique. Petrus Christus, single point perspective, the use of realism, the use of light. So many aspects of art, not only in terms of symbolism and subject matter, but also in terms of art in general. How do they advance artistic techniques? Well, these artists were known to do that. Other things that were really prominent is the idea of pageantry. Many of these artists who came to work in these beautiful Burgundian cities by the Valois knights and dukes, they were very interested in pageantry. And so sometimes sculpture was really big at this time. I'm not covering sculpture. It would be just too momentous of a subject. And also we don't have much sculpture in the Timken. And I like to go along with what we also have. We have a magnificent Petrus Christus in our collection, in our Dutch and Flemish collection, and we will be looking at that shortly. So Le Trois Richiers, the Duc de Berry, one of the Valois dukes, commissioned this group of brothers, the Limburg brothers, to paint an incredible manuscript. It's called Le Trois Richiers, the Very Rich Hours. And of course, these manuscripts were to suggest the calendar, canonical hours, prayers, astrology, and they were very important to these aristocrats. Remember, this is 1460. The printing press wasn't invented until 1440, Gutenberg, for example. And so books were handmade. Who were the recipients of these books? Of course, the aristocracy. These books were magnificent works of art. Many people were involved with creating these books. The artists who illuminated them, the writers, people who created the books themselves using animal glue and different materials for the paper. So it was quite an endeavor. So this is a page from the Trois Richiers, and I did want to mention that so much of these books were so valued and not terribly well known until a much later times, because sometimes they were kept in private use. But the thing I wanted to mention about this book is Le Trois Richiers was a group effort because the Limburg brothers died of plague before the book was completed. And also, unfortunately, the Duc de Berry, who commissioned this illuminated manuscript, also died. So this book was finished by other artists. Now, the Limburg brothers also created Le Bel Hours, the Beautiful Hours, and that was completely made by them. No other artists were involved. So this is a bit more of a collaborative effort. Let's talk a little bit specifically about this wonderful page. The Duke commissioned this to show the months of the year as part of the manuscript. And here we have June, and they're doing hay cultivation. And there were 5 pages of the manuscript that showed the aristocrats in activity, but 7 pages showed the peasants working in the field. And so what we have is the Palais de Cité, the city palace, that is factored into other pages of this incredible manuscript. You see this exquisite church with a rose window. This is of Gothic nature because it's high and spiraled, not curved and low as in the Romanesque. We have fortresses, and we have miniature people entering this beautiful complex. We have workers in the field, women and men, in this rich, beautiful color, hyper detailed. You see the little rows of hay, the little pitchforks, the tiny people, the crenellated towers. It's just amazing. It was suggested, and this might be a little off color, but they said that the Duke really liked to see the peasants in less than complete garb. So we kind of have, you see, where there's a lot of skin revealed here. And that was by the behest of the Duke. So even though this was made in France, and even though the creators were Dutch, this leads us into the style because it was the French court. Now, what was happening is in the late 14th century, up until the late 15th century, we had, as I mentioned, the Valois, the Burgundian court is situated in today Belgium. Where were they? Where is the heart of their ruling? And that would be in today Brussels. So Brussels was where the Burgundian court in Belgium was located. But Belgium is a small country, and these dukes were very mobile. So they loved to go for a time to their homes in Bruges or Ghent, Tournai. And so that's why we have such widespread centers for the creation of artworks for this court. Now, in the latter part of the 15th century, we begin to have a lot of political wars. We have the takeover of the Habsburg monarchy in this region. And eventually by 1517, with Martin Luther nailing the 95 edicts to the church door, we begin to have a separation with the Protestant Reformation. So what we're really going to concentrate on is more or less French, Catholic, highly skilled, trained, beautiful artwork. So let's go to one of the fathers of the Flemish School, and that is Robert Campin. And Robert Campin worked primarily in Bruges. And the artists who worked primarily in Bruges were Jan van Eyck, who also worked in Ghent. We have Jared David, who we're going to look at. We also have some other artists who come in and out of Bruges, but there was a group of artists. So Campin was very important to the development of Flemish art. He was probably the earliest sort of founder of the school. And what we have here is the magnificent Merode altarpiece. So the Merode altarpiece, and you can see it's in the early part of the 15th century, displays so much of what is so magnificent in this region. The use of color, the use of light. Now look at this blue. This was an aquamarine, and some of the blue actually came from lapis, which was brought from Afghanistan, what would be today Afghanistan. And when you see these beautiful natural colors that are so resplendent and rich and deep, you know that they're, of course, natural pigments and materials. But that blue, that's one of the most stellar colors in the repertoire, was most likely from the lapis. So what do we have here? What we have here is the Annunciation, and it's what's called a triptych. A triptych is a three-panel religious painting, and we have diptychs, which are two-panel. We have quadruptychs, four, and then polyptychs, which are much larger. And you will see polyptychs in a little, at least portions of them, like the Ghent altarpiece. So in the Merode altarpiece, we have the donors on the left, and they kneel to watch as Gabriel announces to Virgin Mary that she will birth Jesus. And so it's a very intimate scene. And instead of being outside or in a bigger space, this is a very closed home. So we have the donors, and we have actually a guard at the gate. And what the Flemish painters did, which was very unique, they put as much emphasis in their paintings on the interiors and the landscape as they did with the figures. So it's very common to see highly detailed interiors along with very complex images of people. So in the Merode altarpiece, we have Joseph, and he's in his workshop. And Joseph has a mousetrap, and that is meant to capture the devil. We also have a form of crucifix. It's not exactly crucifix here, but it's in the form of, you see it a couple places. And that's supposed to be also the trap for Satan. What is fascinating to me, right here is the mousetrap, trap of Satan, and then the crucifix reference here. Look at this exquisite Bruges landscape. I mean, it's highly hyper detailed. The gate, the window, You see the Holy Ghost flying in with a crucifix in hand. You see the light as it permeates the room. Again, these artists were very interested in light and realism and naturalism and more three-dimensionality than we saw in the medieval times. Now, many of these artists were also influenced by the International Gothic style, which is very curvilinear and elegant. And we see the gold detail on the wings and this exquisite belt here. And she holds a prayer book. And there's also little still lifes within the painting. Here we have a book of hours, a Majorca ware, urn with a white lily, the purity of Mary. We have a rose bush here that indicates love. And we have a crenellated tower here. The clouds are forming, and it's just such a magnificent depiction. By placing the Annunciation in a room, a closed room, it indicates that Mary and Joseph wanted to have children. And so it's their home, their humble home, but then this revelation comes to them. So quite a remarkable altarpiece. Portraiture is popular. It's emerging in the 15th century. And why is that? Portraiture becomes very important in the 15th century because we start to have like a lot of trade, and we have affluent citizens who want their good works to be shown. That's why we have a lot of donor portraits. And we also have portraits of not only the aristocrats who primarily take up the donor portraits, but also we have portraits like this by Robert Campin. Now, it was originally thought that this was by Rogier van der Weyden, who was his pupil, but this was proven to be a work by Campin. So let's talk a little bit about it. You have these people in very close proximity to the viewer. In other words, they really take up the space. Three-quarter portraits, Campin did those, and hyper realistic. Look at the eyes around the man. He's unnamed. The eyes around the man indicate he's more middle-aged. There's a little bit of wrinkling around the face. And if you look at the beautiful woman who might be his wife, because again, they said that it could be Rogier van der Weyden who painted it, but also could be Rogier van der Weyden who's shown in the portrait. And his wife, the wife of this man, is on my right. And she has a very unlined face, a beautiful face, and deep, beautiful eyes that look sort of a bluish hint. His are brown. And they wore these very complex turbans. What is very typical, too, in this time period is to not include a lot of objects within the scope of the portrait. So we have no attributes, meaning nothing to indicate anything about these people. She wears one ring, a marriage ring, and she has, again, this very complex headdress, red for him, white for her. So we will move on to the great Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck is probably one of the most important artists who ever lived, one of my favorites. As I mentioned, he was born in Bruges, active in Bruges, and he was one of the founders, along with Robert Campin and Rogier van der Weyden, to this incredible school of Flemish painting. Now, some people would call this Netherlandish. I'm going to use the term Flemish, as I started to say earlier, because when I think of Netherlandish, I think of more the Netherlands, which would be today Holland. And so I'm using the term Flemish because this is Belgian, French, in the area of Flanders. Jan van Eyck did work in Ghent on the magnificent Ghent altarpiece, and we are going to talk about that as well. Now, Jan van Eyck had siblings, Margaret, Hubert, and one other. None of the work by Hubert and the other brother were signed. So the attributes for them are pretty sketchy. Hubert, too, there was some mystery, but there were some signed works. And when we look at the Ghent altarpiece, we'll talk a little bit about what his contributions might have been. So he was highly regarded. He worked for Philip the Good, one of the Burgundian and Valois dukes. He traveled. He was actually asked by the Burgundian dukes to go to not Spain, but to Portugal to actually paint a royal portrait. His work was highly collected, and part of it too was because his manuscripts were known at this time, and he actually went to Milan. And so there was a lot of cross-pollination with the work of Jan van Eyck. He advanced oil painting to such a degree, it's just exquisite, illustrious. He did altarpieces, still lifes, altarpieces, portraiture, many different things, and of course, manuscripts. So here we have the Madonna of Chancellor Roland. And this is one of my favorite paintings in all of art history. Why? There's so much complexity to it. So Chancellor Roland was the Chancellor of Autun, Autun in France. And this is probably a landscape of Autun. And we have a beautiful waterway and a cathedral, exquisite Gothic cathedral and a mountain range, and then this hyper detail. Now, he was a very rich man, Roland, and he is being presented to the baby Jesus by Mary is being presented to him in a very shallow space. They're only about 6 feet apart. And it's kind of interesting how he might have even entered this room, this loggia, a loggia being an open room. And we have these Corinthian columns here, very detailed. We have an angel crowning Mary. And we have the baby Jesus offering his benediction to Chancellor Roland, and he holds an orb, Salvator Mundi, Savior of the world. Now we have 2 figures here, red chapeau and individual here. And it's often said that these figures could be Jan van Eyck as an eyewitness to this magnificent scene. The Chancellor has a Book of Hours, a very complex and beautiful suit of clothing, and Mary, wears an exquisite cape. Mary's often depicted in red and blue. We have flowers here, and the flowers create a beautiful still life, and what they do is they reference some of the wonderful attributes of Mary. And then we have a peacock and a magpie. What do they represent? Well, a magpie represents evil, and a peacock represents many things. It represents Jesus sometimes, redemption. And so it's kind of this yin and yang of good and evil. So he places, this is part of the iconographic aspect of the painting. And so, as you can see, so much attention to detail. Everything is minutely shown, so exquisite, and this wonderful use of color. Excuse me. And of course, this is in the Louvre. Probably one of the most famous portraits in all of art history is this one done in 1434 and now in the National Gallery in England. And this is the marriage portrait of Arnolfini. So I told you that Bruges and Antwerp and many of these cities were great repositories for creativity because of the cloth trade in general, manuscript illumination, objects that were made for pageantry and court life. And portraits were being done for the aristocratic class. And who was Arnolfini? Arnolfini worked for the Medici family, the great banking family of Italy. And he came to oversee banking activities in Bruges. So he was Italian, and he commissioned this portrait. The sad history of this portrait, however, if you look at the date, 1434, actually his wife had died. She died in 1433. So this portrait was done posthumously, and they don't even know if in actuality it was a marriage portrait. But we'll go along with them as a couple being portrayed in this sitting area. It's their bedchamber. And we have a beautiful chandelier, and at the top is one candle. And that one candle represents God is present in this room. We have aspects of the last elements of the Passion of Christ. We have a very elaborate gown that she wears, hyper detailed. And some people would have assumed that she was already with child. She was not. She just holds up her dress. A servant would normally have been holding the dress for her. Now, Arnolfini, the merchant banker, is this beautiful, densely woven hat, a fur cloak or mantle, and these very finely made boots and leggings. Some people would say that he's ultra rich, probably not ultra rich, but definitely benefited from association from the Medici. We know that because, again, we have a famous Jan van Eyck painting his portrait. We have elaborate dress, but we don't have elaborate jewelry. And the room is small. So they're wealthy, but again, not of the uppermost class. We have, again, this light pouring through the window. Well, not pouring, but subtly comes through the window. We have a little rose bush that shows true love, and the little dog, the dog of fidelity. And also the shoes would be worn in the house. And again, it's the beauty of love and household objects. Last work by Jan van Eyck, and we could do just a whole talk on him, is the magnificent Ghent altarpiece. The Ghent altarpiece, and I have been very privileged to have seen it a couple times, and actually I've been embarking on a trip to Belgium in about 5 weeks because I want so badly to look at this Flemish art again, go to all the Groningen Museum and Bruges, the St. Bobel's Cathedral and Ghent, where this magnificent altarpiece is located. So what is the little bit of the mystery about this altarpiece? Before Jan van Eyck really settled in Bruges, he did work in Ghent on this altarpiece, and it was said that he worked with his brother. How much did Hubert do? We still don't know. I asked an art historian who was visiting the Timken for a lecture on Flemish art, and she said, we still, so much of it is unknown. It was at first, and sometimes still thought, that Hubert did more of the creation of this 12-panel, double staged vertical altarpiece. Some say he started it, and then he died, and Jan van Eyck, he was the older brother, finished it. It's my supposition, however, that it was primarily done by Jan van Eyck. So let's concentrate on kind of attributing this to primarily Jan van Eyck. What is this altarpiece? It's considered one of the most magnificent altarpieces in all of Western art. And you might have heard some of the stories, if you ever saw the movie The Monuments Men, or seen the magnificent documentary called The Rape of Europa, about how many of these artworks were stolen by the Nazis. This one almost didn't survive. It was also stolen during World War I. It was buried in a salt mine or salt cave in Austria and finally found. One panel has never been found, however. So other times when the Protestant Reformation occurred, there were some musings about destroying this artwork. I mean, it's gone through a really rough history, but suffice to say, with the exception of one missing panel, you will be able to see it if you go to St. Bobel's. So what is this? This is primarily about the redemption of man. And we have the adoration of the mystic lamb who represents Jesus. And we have the water pouring from a fountain, the fountain of life. We have blood coming through the body of Jesus, the lamb, and it's the blood of Christ, his sacrifice. We have musicians and donors and acolytes and all manner of religious figures who witness this scene. And then if you can see a little bit above is the Holy Ghost, and then God above, but you can barely see that. Who was here? Mary, St. John the Baptist, and we also have, some say God, or it could be Jesus in the costume, the robes of a high priest. We have Adam and Eve, and Eve is on the other side. It might be block. I can't see it for sure. Then we have angels singing, and then we have, of course, part of the court, the royal court here. So God is enthroned. We can see the throne here, or Jesus as high priest. the magnificent color, the detail. No, I'm not showing, because of time, I'm not showing the outside, but he used a lot of grisaille on the outside. We have donors, Vision family, Vijn, I believe is the spelling. So they commissioned this, I'm sorry, I misspelled it, Vijdt, Vijit family, who commissioned it, and their donor panels on the outside. We have this grisaille that was used a lot in drawing in the medieval times. And so it's just exquisite. It's magnificent, and it's huge. It's all behind glass, and you can come and just feast your eyes on one of the most magnificent altarpieces ever created. We're going to move on to the work of Rogier van der Weyden. So van der Weyden worked primarily in Brussels and Tournai. So those were the places. But as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of fluidity in how art was collected and distributed. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for Rogier van der Weyden's work to be known throughout today Belgium and into Italy and other places. So he did mostly religious work. As I said, he worked in Brussels and Tournai. He had pupils that studied with him, and we'll talk about that in just a second. He went to Italy and Spain. It was exported to these courts there. Probably one of the most expressive painters in this early Renaissance. So much so that he was considered the first artist to actually use tears on the faces of the figures in his paintings. And if we can see here, Mary, one of the half-sisters of the Virgin Mary, you can actually see tears flooding her face. So the Descent from the Cross, this was commissioned by the Crossbow Guild. And it's also important to note that many of these artists did work in guilds and studios. So we have the crossbow here. We have the skull of Adam. We have a very condensed gold space, like gold leaf. Remember, they were influenced some degree by Byzantine icons. And so we have this gold background. Jesus is being brought down from the cross in this very tragic, filled with pathos altarpiece. And this is the center panel. It's a crowded space. Jesus's body is brought down, elongated, and dropped. And Mary has also dropped to the ground in abject sorrow. But if you look closely, their arms just about touch. See the stigmata, and the form, this curvilinear form, mirrors each other. So who were the people in this? So we have Mary Cleophas, who is a half-sister of Mary. We have John the Evangelist helping to hold Mary up. We have Mary Salome in green. We have Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Nicodemus is in red, Joseph of Arimathea in black and very ornate. And they were known to be the helpers that helped the burial and dealing with Christ's body. We have servants here. One holds a jar of ointment. And then we have, I beg your pardon, and then we have Mary Magdalene here. And then, of course, these were the half-sisters, 1, 2, 3. This blue, this aquamarine blue is just so exquisite. Excuse me, I'm going to pick up something that dropped. So exquisite, that lapis, the brilliant white, how the light shines so dramatically on this figure. So one of the most beautiful central panels of an altarpiece. Now, St. Luke painting the Virgin. This is in Boston. There were more than one version done, but we're going to concentrate on this one, which is in Boston Museum of Fine Arts. St. Luke was a patron saint of artists, and he was also considered by some to be the patron saint of doctors. So here he is in a crowded space again, a loggia, open space, and he's painting the Virgin Mary. And some would say too that this is Rogier van der Weyden himself. This is a self-portrait of him as an artist. We have two other figures here outside, and that's probably Anne and Joachim, the parents of Mary. And they look out through this crenellation to a beautiful waterway, most likely the town of Tournai or perhaps Brussels. But we have some wonderful Gothic architecture here, just exquisite minute detail. We have these Corinthian capitals, a beautiful tapestry that covers sort of a canopy for Mary. She is feeding the little baby Jesus. It's very human and sensitive. You can see if you look closely that actually a little bit of milk is spilled there, and St. Luke looks very carefully at Mary. He looks at her with great detail. Now, in the corner here, we have a bull, and that is sort of the iconographic reference to St. Luke. He holds a stylus, a silver pointed stylus, and he's trying to get so accurately this painting, this face of Mary. So it's beautifully rendered, and I've been so pleased to have been able to see this painting, again, with the flowers, the hyper detail, even to the little Gothic embellishments in the railing. Now we're going to go to the work of Petrus Christus. We are so blessed in the Timken to have a very important Petrus Christus, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. But I do want to talk a little bit about who he was. He lived from 1410 to about 1472. He took over the Bruges workshop of Jan van Eyck. He was a pupil. Jan van Eyck was his mentor. And some people say he worked directly with Jan van Eyck, and he was the successor. Others say he didn't necessarily work directly, but he did take over his studio. But I would say that they probably did work together from some of the stylistic concerns. What did Jan van Eyck contribute besides his magnificent works of art? But as I mentioned, the promotion of oil painting. What Petrus Christus did is help to extend the use of single point perspective. Single point perspective really starts in Western Europe with Petrus Christus. Now, single point perspective was seen in Roman wall paintings, but really, if you think about sort of synthesizing it and understanding it, it was really Petrus Christus. So his work is very distinguished by extreme clarity, his use of exquisite color. He understands linear perspective beautifully. As I said, he worked with Jan van Eyck and primarily worked in Bruges, although he did take a trip to Milan. Rogier van der Weyden influenced his work. He worked in Brussels, but they still understood and saw each other's artwork. So let's look at this goldsmith in his shop. Saint Eligius was the patron saint of goldsmiths, and it was thought that there might have been a halo here. But because a halo was taken out, it is now considered that perhaps this was one of the goldsmiths employed by the Valois dukes, the Burgundian dukes. And so they had private goldsmiths. It could have been an advertisement for this goldsmith to advance his sales, but it is a goldsmith, and he's very detailed. And if you kind of look, he's looking off in another direction, and his face is more detailed even than this aristocratic couple. And you can see that they're very, very wealthy because of the elaborate dress, elaborate headdresses, and then of course this jewelry, and they are buying a wedding ring. And people have asked, rightly, did they use wedding rings? Yes, they did. And so he is weighing gold right here, and there's a lot of different attributes of a goldsmith in this. You see some sizing rings here and rings. We have shark's teeth. What are shark's teeth used for? Well, they were said to be able to determine if poison was present. We have coral to reference that trade was going on a lot in Belgium at the time, particularly in Bruges and Antwerp later, a little bit later. Antwerp is more 16th century. We have some vessels, these beautiful silver vessels that probably reference collecting of alms. We have a pelican eating, and that relates to sin. And we have a marriage belt. So they bring the marriage belt to the goldsmith and show him that they're betrothed and they would like to select a ring. And I think it's kind of just very interesting that we have a couple, a man, probably two men here, and there's a little town outside, a little Flemish town, and they're holding a falcon. So if you look at some of the work in other paintings, we actually have a Veneto Renaissance painting, Italian, but the woman wears falconeering gloves. And that's because falconeering among their aristocracy in the 15th century, it was pretty popular. What do falcons also indicate? That there's some idea of evil associated with them. So we're not quite sure what the intent was. But hyper detailed, a shop with all kinds of objects used by a goldsmith, exquisite dress. You know, you see them carefully stare at the work of the goldsmith, and it just really represents a lovely image of the 15th century. So we're going to go on to the Death of the Virgin. This is part of the Timken collection. It's a center panel for a triptych. So the outer panels were lost during World War II, when a lot of artwork was stolen by the Nazis, taken from private ownership and churches and all kinds of civic places. So the Death of the Virgin, the central panel, this is one of the largest works ever done by Petrus Christus. It's incredible. And we have three sort of things that are occurring in this central panel. We have the actual death of the Virgin. She is in her bedchamber being greeted by apostles, and she lies dying on her bed, and the candle relates to her spirit. We have her in the second of the three sequences. We have her spirit ascending to heaven to be with God, and then we have God here waiting. We have an incredible landscape. And then we have the doubting Thomas, who suggests with the belt of the Virgin Mary that, yes, she has died. And doubting Thomas is saying, no, it isn't possible. It couldn't be. But yes, she has died, and she proves it. The angel proves it. Okay, we'll go back. The angel proves it. Now, someone said, why is one person in a different clothing? Why is one person crying? Well, they're all mourning her loss, and maybe one is sleeping because he's waited so long to find out what is going to happen. But as I mentioned earlier, along with careful detail with the forms, we also have incredible landscape, interior, even a still life. Now, we are going to see the work of Dirk Bouts. And Dirk Bouts was born in Haarlem, so he was actually Dutch, but he worked primarily in Louvain and was the city artist there. He was married to a very rich Louvain woman. He established a workshop with his two sons. He was influenced by Rogier van der Weyden, who worked for a time in Louvain. And you can see a little bit of influence on the face of in the Resurrection. Now, this is a very busy scene, but it's also rather static. His form is very static. He has one foot in the coffin, the sarcophagus, and one steps out. You can see the stigmata. We have a guiding angel here witnessing what has happened, and we have shocked soldiers who are guarding the tomb, like they collapse in awe of what is happening. And we have this really beautiful landscape with figures and some forms here. It looks like a church tower, a campanile, a bell tower, the little detailed, and the wings are very detailed. Everything about it is beautiful, but at the same time, static and then spiritual. So it has many elements. Just because of time, I'm going to go on and show you a beautiful, I use that word too much because these works are also exquisite, an oil-on panel, and this is a Virgin and Child. It's small, it's exquisite. It was based on ancient Byzantine formula, but it doesn't have the gold background, and it has a much more three-dimensional aspect to it. It shows how Mary is extending deep affection to her child. He looks at her, she looks at him lovingly. There's a little bit of a halo you can barely see. There's tenderness, there's simplicity, there's almost no attributes in the painting. It's just a loving relationship, and it really emphasizes human emotion. But because of the crowded space, it's very intense. It has a very intense aspect to it. One of my favorite artists and one of the most important artists who extended this beautiful Flemish style of painting was Hans Memling. And Hans Memling also worked for a time in Bruges. And if you go to Bruges today, to the St. Joseph's Hospital, the oldest hospital from the 12th century in Bruges, this wonderful medieval city, the whole St. John's Hospital, did I say Joseph? I meant John. St. John's Hospital is filled with Hans Memling's work. And this happens to be in Poland, but I will show you one that's actually in the that Bruges St. John's Hospital. So what do we have here? He did work with Roger van der Waard and Hans Memling. He might have been seen him in Brussels. He was German, but he doesn't really show any German stylistic concern in his painting. He always has these very slender figures. And so let's talk about these figures. So we have the Last Judgment, the second coming of Christ, and Christ in a red robe sits atop an orb and representing the earth. And then we have this charming circular rainbow. And he's doing the Last Judgment. And what he does is he watches in judgment as St. Michael the Archangel is weighing souls for judgment, for for either going to hell on my right or heaven on my left, where they're greeted by St. Peter. It is said that here in this little scale that St. Michael the Archangel is holding on my left or his right is considered to be the Portinari, who commissioned the portrait we're going to see a little bit later. And everybody sits here in judgment. We have, as I said, this exquisite Gothic cathedral where people are entering into heaven, all nude, of course. And then on the right, this horrific scene of hell, these tumbling bodies and the fire and brimstone. So you can see his, again, this very stylized triptych. You can also see one thing I did want to mention, the sword and the spiritual lily, white purity, this amazing gold suit of armor and elaborate wings. We've got Satan here extending a whip. So this very stylized triptych. Let's go to another altarpiece that he commissioned, and this is the St. John altarpiece. And this one is actually in St. John's Hospital in Bruges. And it's one continuous kind of skyline, as you can sort of see here. It continues through the three panels of the triptych. And Mary is presented here sitting with St. Barbara, who is the patron saint of miners and soldiers. And you can see that you have soldiers here, a wheel and a sword. And then we have St. Catherine, and she holds a book. And she was a noble, said to be a noble, and she was a patron saint of Christian philosophers and students. And so they sit in awe of Mary as she holds the infant Jesus on her lap. We also have St. John the Baptist being beheaded in this little gruesome portion. You can see his neck and the blood, and a magnificent Bruges landscape. And then we have over here St. John writing the book of Revelations. He's on the island of Patmos in Greece, and he's writing the book of Revelations here, and all manner of activity inside and out of the chamber. Because I'm a little short on time. I'm just going to move on because there's a couple other artists I wanted to show you. This is one of my favorite paintings in all of West Coast art because it's in the very own Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. If you haven't been to the Norton Simon, I highly encourage you to take a day trip, go to the Norton Simon. It's got Zurbarons, it's got the work of Dirk Boutz and Hans Memling. I'm going to show you another work that's in the museum. And this to me is one of the most intriguing portraits of Jesus. Jesus holds his fingers in benediction. It's so human-like. And of course, there's an influence in Byzantine icon creation, but it's a little flat. It has that sort of tiny bit of sensibility to that. But no, this is really unique. So human. He holds his fingers on the ledge. He stares at us with this love of humanity. And I just think it's a very special painting. And as I say, you can actually go see it. Another really unique artist, and now we're toward the end of the 15th century, and I'm only going to show you a couple from the 16th century because I told you the focus is mostly 15th century, is Hugo van der Goes. And Hugo van der Goes did not live a long life. He died in 1442. He died at 42, not in 1442. He died at 42. And he worked with a lot of important artists, but primarily his two sons, because he did create a workshop and it was near Brussels. So he did know the work of Roger van der Weyden. He was mentally ill. So he actually, in his mental illness, decided to enter in Brussels as a lay preacher or pastor, or I should say priest, because he felt like he couldn't finish his work and he was becoming kind of crazed by it. So he had to find a place of contemplation, and he sort of stepped out of the limelight. So this portrait of a young man, again, remarkable portrait. Why? Because his hands are held in prayer. You can even see a little bit of dirt on his fingernails. And the window is a beautiful counterbalance to this exquisite face. You can even see a little stubble, very, very realistic. He holds his hands in contemplation. This was originally rectangular and cut into an oval, and I don't recall why, but look how he looks out of the window sill. Just a really amazing portrait. I'm just going to talk just a minute or two because it's almost time to end, and there's a couple paintings I did want to cover, but probably one of the most religious altarpieces ever done is this Portinari altarpiece at the Uffizi. And it's so filled with Christian iconography. Everything has a meaning. And in fact, not all of it is even understood. So we have the donors here with their patron saints, and we have the infant Jesus being watched by the very rough-hewn shepherds, and we have Joseph, and we have part of the manger here, but the baby's placed on the floor. We have a beautiful early still life, one of the earliest still lifes, with lilies that represent Mary, and the Eucharist here with the wheat and the angels praying. And because it is so detailed, and I just really have just a couple minutes, I'm going to move on, and I don't. Jean d'Ertront is, here's this wonderful work by Gerard David, one of the 16th century painters. And this is the baptism of Christ. And we have St. John the Baptist on the right and an angel witnessing. We have, let's go back. We have the Eucharist. Sorry, I beg my pardon. God here as omnipresent. And we have the white dove, Holy Trinity. And so it's a magnificent landscape, cityscape, and religious painting. And then quickly, just to look at, he too could do these very sensitive, this is the milk soup with the little infant Jesus, very sweet and human. And then we have the first landscape painting by Joachim Pantner. And he was influenced by the great Hieronymus Bosch. And you can see also Albrecht Dürer painted his portrait. Pantner was a remarkable artist. And we see the judgment here, the judgment from hell, and Last Judgment was in the Aeneid and other religious and non-religious works. And we have heaven on the left, my left, and hell here. And Cerberus is guarding, and here's Sharon taking the figures down the river Styx, and this little figure is pointing that he wants to go to hell. And you're probably wondering why that is occurring. But look at this mystical, fanciful landscape. And again, considered probably the earliest landscape where the figure takes over. Now, we have to look for a moment at Pieter Brueghel the Elder. He was 16th century. He did both Catholic and Protestant subject matter, but this is in the Timken, and it's my favorite painting there. Parable of the Sower. As a sower sows seeds, Jesus sows seeds of conversion. And this is a beautiful alpine landscape here because he traveled to Italy and he did see the Alps. Because if you know, he comes from Breda, which is on the Dutch and Flemish border. You wouldn't have seen those Alps. They don't occur. And then lastly, I think we'll just look at this peasant wedding. And this is something that was interesting because Pieter Brueghel the Elder had a son, Pieter Brueghel, who also did a lot of peasant works and genre scenes. This is considered a genre scene because it shows how the peasants interacting. But we have a wedding and of a peasants, not of the upper classes. He liked depicting the peasants more. We have a little young boy. He isn't wearing it's without pants because he's really a little young, and he's watching. And then we have servants with a door, and they're serving soup, bread, and some kind of soup, bread, and some porridge. And then we have people watching. And it is laughed about because it looks like there's extra legs here. Well, Brueghel was a great painter. It wasn't extra legs. It's the man's foot here. So here's the bride. She's wearing a crown, and there's a paper crown above her. Here's one of the wealthier members of the community. He graces their presence, and he's dressed very well. Where's the groom? And there was an old proverb that said, if you're too poor, I'm paraphrasing, you might not even be able to attend your own wedding. So the groom could be here. Pardon, he could also be here serving, because sometimes the grooms would have to serve in a peasant type wedding. But suffice to say, he really captures the activities of these people. There's little dogs trying to grab food from under the table. I'm trying to find the dog. The peasants enjoying themselves, eating, drinking, and being merry. And we'll end there with, well, we don't have time to talk too much about this. So I think Renata might have some questions for us. And so if time permits, I'll talk.
We do have one question from Facebook asking, what is a marriage belt?
Oh, a marriage belt was just a garment that might have been worn by a young woman who was betrothed. So it's just an item of indication that she was married. And also, you know, and these belts come sort of a religious context, because remember I mentioned that Mary was wearing a belt too. So it's article of clothing. It has religious connotations, but also symbolic of weddings and betrothal. But that's a good question. Any other questions?
Sorry, I was muted. Giselle asks, can you please explain the distemper tempera?
Oh, yes. And let's go back because I want to show you the difference. Hold on. That's a great question. Okay, distemper. They use a type of cloth material, and well, I believe it was a little more loosely woven, but this painting style made a more matte finish. So using this material, distemper on linen, is a more matte form use of color on the woven linen. So I don't mean to be confusing. Let's start again. They use this type of matte finish with the paint to give it a different kind of texture. So you can see that this is much more matte compared to this. So this is just oil on panel, but this temper on linen gives a matte finish. The problem is it was ephemeral. So it wasn't a good, if you look at through the paintings that I've shown you in the altarpieces, if they were paintings, they didn't use distemper very often because it wasn't a sturdy medium. So, but that's a very good question. Why the term distemper? You think about dogs, I guess, when you think about distemper. But yeah, it did create this very, very matte finish. But this painting did fade. In fact, so much so that there was a lot of they had to do a lot of conservation on it. And oh, before I forget, this is also in the Norton Simon. So if you have need another excuse to visit the Norton Simon, this would be one of them to see this magnificent Dick Bouts.
We have a comment from Ryan that says, "Thank you, Karen, for coming back with info on the copper question from last time. That's true dedication." And
I was going to be right on that. In fact, as soon as I finished the lecture, I thought, wow, that was such a good question. And I had no idea. And I don't like that. So, and I wanted to hopefully be able to tell you this month. So thank you for returning and getting the answer to the question. This is in the Timken, by the way. Since we're kind of closing up, this is a wonderful donor panel, 16th century. And you see Mary, Queen of Sorrows, with her 7 trials and tribulations represented by these swords. So this shows that by the 16th century, the Flemish were controlled by the Habsburg dynasties, a little bit less, I would say, focus on, we're moving away from the French court and now the Habsburgs. So there's a lot of war going on because of the Protestant Reformation. So that's why I chose to concentrate more thoroughly on the 15th century.
We have 2 quick questions, actually.
Sure.
And one from Facebook that asked, "Are there any colors that were avoided in this style and period? I love the striking blue, white, and earthy red."
Oh, absolutely. I don't know of any colors that resisted. They primarily use pigments and natural elements that were accessible to them. For example, now I'm fast forwarding to the Baroque, and I should have fast forwarded to the Baroque when we looked at the marriage portrait of Arnolfini, because that mirror there, which shows Jan van Eyck probably as a witness, was used in Velázquez painting of Las Meninas. So that use of mirrors that Petrus Christus and Jan van Eyck used were copied in the Baroque. But so going back to the colors, it is known that in Holland, for example, what today Holland, the Netherlands, lapis was so expensive that you had to have a patron to actually purchase it for you, like with the work of Jan Vermeer. And so if it was avoided, it was maybe because of cost. So what was accessible to them and what was affordable. But remember, many of these were commissioned by very wealthy people. So the materials were not as, let's say, not as restricted. So I hope that answers the question. Was there one more question, Renata?
Yes, there are 2 sandals in the marriage portrait of Arnolfini and 1 sandal in one of the triptychs. What do these sandals mean?
They refer to hearth and home. So they would often take off, let me just see if I can get back to that. They would often take their shoes off to enter their homes, these small spaces. And so that relates to the home. This is our space, this is our home. And then also fidelity is the shoes and the dog. So it's like the love of our home and hearth, and also dog fidelity, hearth and home sandals. But I'm sorry I'm going over, but this is really important that I didn't talk about it, is if we see that probably Jan van Eyck himself was a witness, because it even states that here in his signature. And then, of course, God is omnipresent with the white candle up here. So I'm sorry I forgot to mention the mirror, because it is really important, because they extended the use of these mirrors. Let me see if I can find, let's see. No, I guess I can't. I don't have it right now, but
in your picture of the gold person doing the gold, sitting on the ledge, there is a mirror pointed outward to the street. And that
The
looks,
goldsmith. Let me get back. Let me just, because I want to, hold
yeah,
up.
this one. Yeah.
Yes. Again, that's the one. Thank you.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's like, he's got an indoor shop. He's facing outward, and the little mirror represents customers who are on approach. And
Exactly. And then, of course, that lineage of Pieter Brueghel, Petrus Christus, Jan van Eyck, both using the mirrors. And then, of course, it shows how important their work was to other European courts. And then, just as Dee Dee points out, that, yeah, you could look out, you could see, I mean, it's very clever because you look out and you can see the street. It's kind of an advertisement. And also, there's this, emblematic thing of the falcon. So the detail is, what is it? The beauty's in these details that these artists use, but just all the implements and elements of the goldsmith shop, just very, very unique. But good point. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dee Dee. Any other questions?
There's a few comments. Giselle says, thank you for answering my questions and for this wonderful lecture. Joshua says, thank you, Karen. Very enjoyable overview of the period's primary artist. Marion says, can we organize a trip to the Northern Simons? Such a great place. And Ryan actually asked if any of these pieces are in the Getty Center, as far as you know.
Oh, oh gosh, of these I've shown no, but the Getty Center is manuscript illuminated. If you want to see the most incredible collection of illuminated manuscripts, the Getty has a remarkable collection. The Nortons, the Huntington Library also, but really it's the Getty Center that has exquisite illuminated manuscripts from like 15th century, 14th century. One other thing I forgot to mention, that if, yes, Marianne, who is an art historian and a docent as well, I think that's a great idea. I think anybody who's interested, we should really go to the Norton Simon in the Huntington Library, because they do some remarkable exhibitions, and also just to see these works of art, just right, 2 hours away from us. And then, of course, in our Timken, the Brueghel and the Petrus Christus and the Claeissens. So we have 3 right there in our own museum. But that's a good idea, Marianne. I'm going to pursue it.
Nancy says, I learned so much. Thank you, Karen. Elliot asked if we could use a larger pointer in our presentation, and I would have to research that to see if Zoom allows that, but I'll look into it. And Giselle says, please let me know when you come to the Getty Center. As a docent, I would enjoy meeting your team.
Oh, that is wonderful. That's a very lovely comment. And I don't handle any of the technology, as Renata knows. That's not in my very strong wheelhouse. So Renata would have to know about the expanding the imagery, because I think this is about as far as it goes. But we'll look into it. I really appreciate everybody attending, and I just want to make a comment. It's just, when I do these lectures, my intent really is, I could do just one artist, but I kind of like to do this as an overview, so that you kind of understand a little bit of what, like, let's say, Flemish Renaissance is like. And then if this is something you really like, then it gives you a platform to do some of your own exploration. I just like to give an overview, because there's so many wonderful artists in each period. And so sometimes I don't get to all the details, but that's kind of my quest, just to get people interested and get a kind of an overview of these time periods and countries and so forth, and artists. So.
All right, without any more questions or comments, I want to thank you all so much for sticking with us. And thank you so much, Docent Halmerson, for such a fascinating and engaging tour. Before you go, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our Facebook page. If you would like to find further information on any future tours being put on by the Timken Museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and thank you, Docent Halmerson, for a wonderful presentation. Goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Okay, what else?